Good morning, and welcome to this event on executing a national technology strategy. My name is Martijn Rasser. I'm a senior fellow and director of the Technology National Security Program here at the Center for New American Security. Technological leadership, how a country invents, innovates, and deploys technologies to compete economically and to secure its interests, will shape the coming years to a remarkable degree. The United States has maintained such leadership for decades. Today, however, that leadership is at risk. The United States is failing to rise to the occasion. Its policies inadequate and disconnected, and its response reactive and disjointed. The country needs a new approach to regain the initiative. The US government must craft a national technology strategy for an era of sustained competition with a highly capable contender. A comprehensive framework to plan, execute, and update technology policies. Joining us today to discuss what such a strategy should look like, what's at stake, and what specific actions the United States should take are some of the leading thinkers on this topic. And I want to invite you, our viewers, to join the conversation. You can submit questions using the chat box on the webpage cnas.org/live, or you can tweet them to us using the hashtag CNAS2021. And you can do so throughout the event. So let's jump right in. I'm very pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Senator Michael Bennet. Senator Bennet has represented the state of Colorado since 2009 in the US Senate. He previously served as superintendent of Denver Public Schools. He was chief of staff to the mayor of Denver and had a career in finance. The senator is an advocate for American technology competitiveness and has introduced numerous bipartisan amendments and standalone legislation to maintain American leadership in science and technology. Senator, it's an honor to have you here. Welcome to CNAS.
Well, thank you, Martin, and thanks to CNAS for hosting this timely discussion. I'm looking forward to your questions, and I can't tell you how grateful I am for the Center's terrific work on this issue and so many others we face as a nation. You consistently set the bar for thoughtful, independent, and pragmatic analysis, and that is needed now more than ever before. Let me start with an observation by agreeing with Martin. Anyone who has studied our history knows how vital America's technology leadership has been to our economy and to our security. Less obvious is how crucial it's been to democracy, not only here, but around the world. Just consider the fate of democracy if Hitler and not Truman had won the race to a nuclear weapon, or if Soviet scientists and engineers and not America's had consistently dominated the latest Cold War technologies, or more recently, if the internet emerged from a PLA research lab instead of DARPA. America's technology leadership gave democracy a crucial edge over authoritarianism in the 20th century. By powering our economy, fortifying our defense, and driving the development of new tech toward our deepest values. And I think the question in front of us today, and why this is such a timely conversation, is whether that will remain true in the 21st century, because we are quickly losing ground. Pick a key technology from AI to quantum computing to hypersonics, and you'll find China either racing ahead or closing the gap. The wake-up call for me was 5G. Even though experts had told us for years about its importance, Washington was still caught completely flat-footed, as was industry in the United States. And in this case, we were lucky because the Senate Intelligence Committee was able to sound the alarm, invest in alternatives like ORAN, and keep most of our allies from signing a 30-year contract with Beijing. I think everybody on this phone call knows how hard it is to get out of a phone contract themselves. And the last thing we would want is for our allies to be in a 30-year contract with Beijing. But last minute scrambling is not a strategy, nor is it a guarantee that we can improvise our way through for 6G or biotechnology or whatever else is around the corner. And I can assure you, China is not waiting for us to get our house in order. They are on their 14th five-year plan. They've connected almost 90% of their consumers to ultra-fast internet compared to our 25%. They're building factories for electric vehicles as fast as the rest of the world combined, they've tripled their doctorate degrees in science and engineering over the past 20 years, and they've done it relying on tools that Stalin could only dream of to entrench their surveillance state by vacuuming up data about their citizens, every internet search and financial transaction and facial expression, to say nothing of the smart cities that they've created around the world. China is pursuing a China first policy by any means necessary, licit or illicit. And the question for us is whether we're content to be collateral damage or whether we will offer a compelling alternative and show the world that democracy, and especially American democracy, can meet the challenges of the 21st century. I strongly believe that we can, but we need a new approach and we need it quickly. Here are the top 4 items on my list, but there are many others I'd be happy to discuss. First, we need a national technology strategy. Whether we like it or not, we're in a race with China for the 21st century, but unlike Beijing, we have no idea where we want to go or how fast we're going to get there. It doesn't mean we should be copying them by picking national champions or imposing a one-size-fits-all approach, but it does mean we should act urgently to identify priorities, align federal policies and investments, and mobilize the nation in a coherent and enduring way. Here, at least, we've made some progress. Earlier this year, I secured a provision in the Intelligence Authorization Act, creating a national technology strategy, and I'm going to do everything I can to get it passed. Second, I propose that we create a National Technology Competitiveness Council at the White House to develop this national strategy and to lead its implementation across the entire government. Today, there is no standing entity empowered to bring different agencies together at the highest levels to assess where we stand on key emerging technologies or mobilize a coherent and comprehensive response to secure U.S. leadership. This has produced damaging gaps in federal policy, where the IC may be raising alarms about a certain technology on the one hand, while the rest of government continues with business as usual, when it could be acting to tighten export controls or investment screenings or to shore up key supply chains. I point you to the example of what China has been able to do in space, in part by stealing our IP, and we just can't continue to do that to ourselves. Third, we have to scale up the government's tech talent, which today is really not what it needs to be. We can have all the strategies and structures in the world, but it won't add up to much without talent, and that's why I propose to create a National Digital Reserve Corps to allow skilled workers from the private sector to serve in government as short-term advisors. This is not a panacea, but I think it's an important start. And I think there are a lot of people out there in the private sector that would want to lend their talent. And finally, we've got to make sure that American technology reflects American values, and that as technology is deployed around the world, whether it's AI or quantum computing, that it reflects democratic values. There's nothing fundamentally democratic about technologies like AI. Their fate depends on the choices we make, the example we set, the values that we import into the standards committees and to the debate, the global debate around the world. And that's why I've introduced bipartisan bills with Senator Ben Sasse to promote a model of American technology that leads with our values. For example, by requiring federal agencies to name a full-time lead for the responsible use of emerging tech, and by conducting a top-to-bottom assessment of federal uses of AI to make sure they align with privacy and civil rights. These are just a few of the many efforts we need to pursue. As many others have said, we're entering what could be one of the most disruptive periods in human history, propelled by a convergence of technologies we can barely fathom. We have already seen how inattention to such disruption has undermined our democracy as people see economic inequality rising, economic mobility collapsing, and the government doing nothing. That should seize our attention. Our founders studied history, and they knew that economic insecurity breeds tyranny. They understood that democracies often collapse under the ambition of craven politicians offering false promises of prosperity to consolidate their power. And in that sense, this conversation is about much more than beating China in AI or quantum computing. It's about renewing American democracy and reaffirming its example to the world for ourselves, for the next generation, and for humanity. So I am deeply grateful to CNAS for hosting this timely discussion and inviting me to join this morning. I'm happy to stop there and turn it back over to Martin to take whatever questions you've got. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Senator. And I'd like to have my colleague, Megan Lamberth, join us here. Megan is going to explore these very important issues that you raised in more depth and field some audience questions as well. Megan is a research associate on the Technology and National Security team here at CNAS, and also the co-author of 2 of the 3 reports so far in our National Technology Strategy series. So, Megan, great to have you with us.
Thank you, Martin. And thank you, Senator Bennet, for joining us today and taking the time to give us those remarks. You've given us a lot to talk about, but I know we're short on time, so we'll just dive right in.
It sounds to me like I should be asking you the questions rather than you asking me the questions, but I'm happy to try.
Perfect. Well, Senator, I'd love to start with just a question to really ground our discussion this morning. As your remarks alluded to, you've been a strong supporter of legislation in Congress that's focused on bolstering U.S. competitiveness in technology, particularly with regard to China. And so in your own words, how would you frame this new era of technology competition? In what areas do you think the U.S. is doing particularly well? And what key areas should be prioritized?
Well, I think actually our leadership on the virus and on vaccine technology is a good example of what we're doing really well. And that's true for biotechnology all across the country. Our job there is not to catch up with China, but to make sure we hold on to what we have. And that's a good example of that. Places of concern to me are telecommunications, national security, very broadly, semiconductors, which 85% of which are now being produced in Taiwan, and so much of American life depends on those semiconductors that we should be thinking very hard about how to get the talent we need here to be able to begin to fabricate those here, or to be able to fabricate them in places around the world where we're not concerned that China might want to take over. And by the way, I am not in any way suggesting we should be going to war with China or be in a conflict with China. But I think it is very important for us to acknowledge that all of the lullabies that we told ourselves when they entered the WTO, that they were somehow going to change their ways, that democracy would break out in China, that the internet would be a democratizing influence in China. None of that, it must be said, has turned out to be true. And we need to recognize that because as I said earlier, we run the risk of being collateral damage. I would argue that we are at a point right now where China is using the internet and social media to export its surveillance state around the world and to deepen its authoritarian hold on its own countrymen, the Chinese government doing that. And it is spawning chaos in democracies all over the Western world, like the chaos we saw on January 6th. So those are some of the things that I think are in the balance.
No, thank you for that, Senator. An item on your list of priorities was talent. And I know you're a former superintendent of a public school system, so I know you've thought a lot about education and workforce challenges. Could you talk a little bit about ways the country could ensure it has the science and technology talent it needs for the future?
So this will not come as a surprise, what I'm about to say, to anybody who's been a high school student in America, which is that in general, we have made the teaching of science and technology as boring as we could possibly make it for kids in high school, and they turn away from it as a result. We're teaching it but mostly the way it was taught 50 years ago, and we're teaching it in ways that doesn't allow the kids to see the relevance of learning science and technology. The second kids see the relevance to our economy or to their future it all turns around. And so what I think is that we should be committing ourselves as a nation to the idea that no kid is going to graduate from high school without the skills to earn a living wage, not just the minimum wage, and that they will have acquired those skills through a combination of high school accreditations, university and community college, however it is they get it, but so that we know when we're launching kids out into the world, they're either equipped to do the work of a four-year college, or they're equipped with the technical skills to be able to earn a living wage on the way to college. And I think what we would find is if we combine that with the idea of apprenticeship programs during high school, where kids were in high school, let's say 3 days a week, as they are, some of them in the Denver public schools, my old school district, and 2 days a week, they were with an employer where they were learning and applying those technical skills, that we would find not only that we would dramatically increase the people going into STEM fields in our country at a time when we desperately need them, but we would transform the lives of millions of Americans, and we would transform the American economy. One of the fundamental problems we have as a country is, for the last 50 years, the economy has grown really well for people at the very top, but not for anybody else. If we changed our public education system the way I just described, I think it would be transformational to answering that question, which of course is also critical to the democracy, because once people lose sight of opportunity, that's when democracies begin to collapse. And we obviously can't let that happen.
Thank you, Senator. No, those would be transformative ideas. Another item that you had on your list of priorities was this idea of a White House Technology Competitiveness Council, which I know was part of an amendment that you brought up to the Innovation and Competition Act. Could you talk a little bit about what that council should look like in your mind, and what its primary function would be?
Yeah, and this is, again, with Ben Sass, he's a great Republican from Nebraska. Basically, if we can imagine a world where we have a national technology strategy, and let me just say a word about that first. I cannot tell you how frustrating it's been to sit there on the Intelligence Committee and for years to have learned about 5G is the best example that I can talk about, but I can tell you it's not the only example. To have learned about that there and know that we were not acting, at Commerce to deal with it. We were not acting on export controls to deal with it. We were not acting as the State Department to deal with it. Mark Warner, finally, our chairman, did a very effective job, I think, of blowing the whistle here with the rest of the committee. But that suggested to me that we were not integrated in the way we needed to be. And in some ways, the institutional design, well understood and for good reasons, of keeping Intel secret from everything else, was actually compromising our ability to compete. And that's what led to the idea of having a national technology strategy to insist that we actually had a coherent point of view. And the idea of having the National Technology Council was to elevate it, to put it in the White House, like the Space Council or something else like that, run by the vice president with the relevant intel agencies and other agencies like Commerce and Treasury, to be there to make sure that we at a high enough level in the White House, we actually were developing this strategy. This strategy is as important to us as any strategy, I think, would be. It's just that we're not doing it right now. And I think it may sound horribly bureaucratic to set up a council, but I haven't thought of a better way. And I do think that when it's not somebody's daily job to think about things, they have a way of falling to the side, which introduces one more idea, which I will not belabor, but we have got to elevate our gaze. We are in this short-term world of our political debate that is basically taking place between the commercial breaks on the cable television at night. That is not, their revenue model should not be driving our politics. Their revenue model should not be driving our democracy, and it should not be driving the long-term approach. And my hope is that having a technology council like this would insulate us in some respects to be able to drive on a longer field of vision instead of the day-to-day short-term course that we've tragically been on for too long.
Totally agreed. Thank you, Senator. And in line with this theme of a national technology strategy, we have a question from an audience member, Nicholas, who asked about allies and multilateral cooperation. So he said allies would be an essential part of executing a national technology strategy. What areas, Senator, do you think are ripe for collaboration with like-minded countries?
All of them. I mean, I was on the phone yesterday with some folks from Carnegie talking, they're trying to think about how we could work with other democracies to make sure, for example, that AI is approached consistent with our democratic values. And I think that the simple fact that we live in a world where most people in the world don't want to be dominated in a unipolar world. They want to be, they don't want to be dominated by anybody, but they would rather have a bipolar world where the economy is growing across the world for everybody, and China and the US are participating in that in a peaceful way. Unlike China, we only have 330 million people here, which means that if we want to, for example, apply AI to the question of beating cancer, we're going to need not just we're going to need not just to have the humans in America that have suffered from cancer to think about how to do that. We're going to need to have the rest of humanity that's not part of China. China can do it by themselves. The same is true when you think about vaccines and many other kinds of things. So this is yet another place where I think that the wind is pushing at our back to say to us, United States of America, please lead the world in these coalitions that will allow us to have a more peaceful coexistence with China throughout the 21st century, whether it's our shared economic interests, our trade interests, our national security interests, the extent to which we share democratic values, which many of those countries do. And so for me, that creates a moment of great, or a feeling of great optimism about the world we're heading into here. I think that, there's no one else in the world that can lead that coalition, and we have always been best in doing that. I think when we stood both for democracy and for opportunity, and so much of what we're talking about today too has the potential, including the education stuff we talked about, but also bringing back manufacturing. So much of what we're talking about today is the opportunity to create an economy for the 21st century that actually lifts wages in these economies that aren't China and creates good jobs. And that's when we've been at our strongest, and I think when our example has shown brightest. So I actually feel quite optimistic about the kind of alliances that you're talking about.
Senator, I think that's a really great note to end on. I know we're unfortunately out of time, but thank you so much for joining us and for your candor. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Whenever anybody thanks me for my candor, I worry that I said something I shouldn't have said. But I look, time, we have to be honest about it, and we've got to, I think, be honest about the ways in which we're not meeting the moment and the great opportunity the moment provides us. So thank you for having me today. I really appreciate it, and let me know how I can be helpful.
Absolutely. Thank you, Senator.
Thanks. Bye.
And it's my pleasure to turn it back over to Martijn Rasser for the panel portion of our event. Martin?
Great. Thank you so much, Megan. And thank you again to the Senator. I'd love to invite our panel members up to the virtual stage. Joining us today, we have Mike Brown, Director of the Defense Innovation Unit, Lauren Schulman, Vice President for Research and Evaluation at the Partnership for Public Service, Emily Kilcrease, Senior Fellow and Director of the Energy, Economics, and Security Program here at CNAS, and John Costello, who is a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Intelligence and Security at the Department of Commerce and an Adjunct Senior Fellow at CNAS. Welcome to you all. The Senator had some great insight that he shared with us, and obviously there's a lot of legislation that is percolating on Capitol Hill that is very relevant to the crafting of a national technology strategy and, of course, the execution of a national technology strategy. I think one area where I'd like to start is with talent, right? And we need the right people to actually be able to execute such a strategy. So, Mike, let me start with you. So, one of the enduring challenges facing the Department of Defense and government writ large is competing with the private sector to recruit and retain talent in the tech sector. So, from your perspective, what are some policies that the Department of Defense has implemented that seem to work quite well, but what more needs to be done? Where are areas where we're falling short?
Well, I think, Martin, thanks for having us and for sponsoring this event at CNAS. I think, as you have alluded to, what we're doing to bring in tech talent in the department is insufficient to meet the challenge. So we have some successes, as you point out. There are a number of fellowship programs. One is sponsored by DIU, the Technology and National Security Fellows Program, that brings in 8 people. There are a number of these programs around the department, but it's really not meeting the need. When you have an organization like the JAKE, the Joint AI Center, that is going to be successful if it's staffed with a lot of folks who are familiar with AI. And too often our tendency is to staff it with military officers. DIU has a motto where we're trying to combine both the military officers that we're assigned, that we really select one by one, along with commercial technology executives like myself that we're bringing in. So we need to have more blended workforces in the areas of DoD that require that. I think that's certainly true with the R&E organization that DIU is a part of, but extends broader to that to other organizations. The Defense Digital Service is an example of bringing in specific talent to do a need where we're able to bring in folks with the requisite technology talent. But I guess the main point is the successes here are too small relative to what we need for the challenge going forward.
Great, thank you, Mike. Now, Lauren, you've done quite a bit of work in this area, right? The question of talent retention in particular. What are some of your thoughts on this particular issue when you look at USG as a whole?
Thanks so much for having me, Martin. So I'll offer a couple of points to build on Mike's really great offering there. First, it is absolutely true that the U.S. government struggles to recruit, retain, and I think most importantly, utilize technology talent. And I want to start with some of the ways that we try to get at this issue. And quite frequently, we turn to, let's create a fellowship, a short-term program that's going to bring in temporary talent to support. I think we need to recognize the key word in that phrase, temporary. We're not building sustainable talent models that we can imbue understanding of technology, technology acumen, familiarity so that you can actually build policy around them. We're not inculcating those into the federal workforce in a way that would make that more sustainable. If we are relying on talent models that assume a 0% retention rate, and which is effectively what we do with USDS and other fellowship programs, we're never going to have a federal workforce that is successful at implementing so many of the issues or working on so many of the issues that the senator raised earlier in the discussion today. So I think there's a few things. One, finding better on-ramps for those programs so that once you've recruited in that short-term space, that you can on-ramp some of those really talented, really dedicated public servants in a longer-term permanent positions. Second is something that some of my peers on this call have talked about before, and that is there's actually a lot of people within the federal government who have this interest, specialty, and expertise and are not being effectively used either in their current roles or being brought on into the teams who you may need that. As opposed to constantly thinking we need to go outside and bring in that really genius person from Google or Facebook or Silicon Valley. Look within the federal government and make sure you're actually giving current federal civil servants the playing field and the tools that they actually need. The third thing I would say in this is that that whereas the military does I don't want to say wonderful, a very good job of thinking through professional development, training, and education for uniformed service members, it does, frankly, an atrocious job of looking at civil servants and thinking through how do we invest in civil servants' professional development, utilize those investments in order to bring them into roles that make sense for them, and then give them challenges and opportunities that are meet the need in terms of if you've created this incredible talent, if you're not actually giving them the opportunities to actually succeed and apply those talents, they're going to want to leave. There's, as a final point, I'll mention a great analogy that many of our friends, Josh Marcuse, has said. If you bring on a World Cup team, and we do that both by bringing in fellows, we bring it by finding talent from within the federal government and otherwise, and you don't give them a playing field, a soccer ball, or a chance to actually play, why did you bother bringing on the World Cup team? We need to make sure that we're building that infrastructure to actually let them play the game that they are meant to do.
Thank you, Lauren. Emily and John, I want to turn to you both. I'll ask you the same question, but I'd like to get your thoughts based on your experience at USTR and Commerce, respectively. How do you, in terms of the competition with China overall, what do you see the opportunities and the challenges being for crafting and executing a U.S. national technology strategy? And particularly as this competition evolves, how do you see that dynamic shifting over time, and how should the U.S. government respond to that? Emily, let's start with you, please.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Martin. On the economic competition and technology competition with China, I think folks have woken up to the fact that this is the defining challenge of how we're going to structure the bilateral relationship moving forward. And it does underscore the need to have a technology strategy in order to set long-term priorities, allocate resources, and align resources in support of that. One thing I think that's been notable in the debate recently, and this is starting to shift, is this focus on the use of defensive tools, looking at export controls, looking at investment screening as kind of the primary way in which we're going to manage this technology competition with China. Those are important parts of the overall strategy, but they're wholly insufficient to get us where we need to be, both in terms of utilizing technology to advance kind of our own assessment of where the United States needs to be in terms of developing its own economy, as well as in a relative comparison to competing with China. And so it is great to hear about efforts to move forward with a more proactive and affirmative agenda about what the technology needs are of the United States as an absolute matter, and how we can put the right funding and resources into that sort of strategy.
Great, thank you so much, Emily. John, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this point.
Excellent, thanks, Martin, and thanks for having me. What an august panel of experts to be joining. Forgive me, just a quick phone call. So I would agree with Emily, I think, wholeheartedly. One of the major, I think, opportunities and major strengths of the U.S. is the strength of its defensive options, which in the U.S. over the last few years has sort of not woken up, but starting to have a growing realization that it has a number of options to shape global supply chains, to mitigate its own risk, and if necessary, to hamper or undermine the efforts of a strategic adversary to pursue technologies that could be used against us or have been sourced illegally or extra legally from the intellectual property or the work of U.S. citizens without any sort of remuneration. I think those are some key issues with regards to China. But I think as we look forward, I agree with Emily, that is entirely insufficient to meet the problem, nor is it from a public policy standpoint a really defensible position to not have an affirmative vision of where we want to be. I think one of the biggest challenges for the U.S. is China has done very well, both internally and externally, putting forward a very, to them, very positive vision of where they want to be in the emerging technology space, a very compelling one, certainly for their citizens, their academics, their industry. And the U.S., I think, the call to the U.S. is to put forward something equally compelling. I think, forgive me for saying so, but I think the Biden administration is doing that. I think some of the advantage the U.S. has is its network of allies, a long-standing history of being a central player in the global economy and in allied relationships and partner relationships in the Indo-Pacific and with Europe. And it's far more integrated in that way and has far more of a stake in the international economic and the international political order. I think what we're seeing here is especially over the last few months, the United States start to draw upon that in crafting and pushing forward that affirmative vision.
Excellent. Thank you, John. Mike, I want to turn back to you and revisit the question that Nicholas asked earlier. So I think the whole notion of better cooperation, collaboration with partners and allies is going to be fundamentally important if any type of national technology strategy is to be effective. Do you talk a little bit about how you see the role of like-minded countries playing into an overall U.S. Technology strategy, and perhaps if you can talk about some of the things that the Department of Defense is doing right now in that regard, for example?
Yeah, so I think I would start with what John and Emily were alluding to really have an effective national technology strategy. This requires investment. We have to coalesce around what are the critical technologies that we want to make sure that we're leading. You call for that in the report that you just wrote. So we need a definition that's government-wide of what are the critical and emerging technologies. Probably also need to include in that the important technologies we got to make sure we are retaining leadership in, semiconductors, aerospace as an example. So we need to start with the what. After that, how are we going to make sure that we continue to maintain the leadership that the senator talked about that's eroding? And I certainly agree with him on that point. So this requires a national statement that we want to be premier in these technologies. It's going to require investment in basic research. Your previous question was about talent. It's going to require the right talent. We've got to encourage that. These are technical fields, so STEM talent. We did that before in response to Sputnik in the 1960s, where we started graduating more and more engineers. Senator talked about the fact that China now has created a pretty big gap in terms of the number of engineers they're graduating relative to the US. So we need to step up to the investment that's required. In your report, you mention a statistic that I quote often. The federally funded R&D has declined precipitously since the Cold War. So in the 1960s, 2% of GDP. Now for national security oriented activity, 0.35. So we've let that decline pretty dramatically. And as we, I'm sure would all agree, that foundation that comes from federally sponsored R&D with the long-term horizon, the ability to take risk, really is what promotes tremendous economic prosperity, because it provides the foundation through internet, GPS, and miniaturized electronics that creates untold industries, startups, and allows the U.S. to lead the world. So that I think is the starting point. Now to your question about allies. Yes, a critical part of that. We don't need to view the competition with China in a bilateral fashion. This is, as the senator talked about, this really is about which way of life do we want to predominate, and it's critically important for democracies. So in that sense, we need to think about these technologies that are critical and which countries, it's not going to be the same group for every technology. If you take semiconductors as an example, which are the countries we want to pull together for that? Certainly we need Taiwan with TSMC's participation there, Japan, South Korea, even some countries you might not think about, like Holland, that provide very important technology through the advanced lithography. So pulling together the relevant countries per technology and then meeting with them to talk about standards, what research can be done that's not duplicative, that we want to foster. And then, of course, this is where it comes back to some things in the report you talk about, coordinated trade and government policy to make sure that we've created markets among those countries to be working with each other, rather than that being a free-for-all with no thought to how do we make sure that the companies can be successful because we've made sure there's no trading barriers for those technologies to be successful among the countries that we're cooperating with. So there's a tremendous agenda that we need to get started on for the U.S. to be competitive, and then what we do with our allies to make sure that between the U.S. and our allies, we're leading in these critical and emerging technologies, and then the ones we need to maintain our leadership for.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Mike. And it's great to see that there is some good momentum right in that direction with the quadrilateral security dialogue, for example, and the Australia, UK, US agreement. There's a very important emerging tech component to both those efforts, and hopefully we'll have some productive interactions with the European Union through the Trade and Technology Council as well. I want to turn to a few audience questions. The first one is from Bill Hannes, who's with the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown University. And Bill notes that we don't know how competitive we are if we lack a reliable assessment of China's S&T progress. And what do you think about setting up a standalone national S&T analysis center focused on foreign research? And Bill specifies that he would like that that analysis center to be located outside of the intelligence community. I'll open that up to the panel for a reply.
I'm happy to weigh in on this. I think it's understanding the U.S.'s competitiveness on the technology front is difficult for a few, and we talk about this in the report. For one, the technology is a function of both national security and economics. I think the IC in general, for much of its history, has been focusing largely on national security, with DoD as the primary customer. That is not a bug; that is a feature for many things. But when we start talking about technology, and we really want a good economic assessment, which really is the lifeblood for technology, I think you run into some challenges as to who the ultimate customer of that is. I think there is a case. I think we make a case in the paper for an open source research capability that can understand the relative competitiveness of the U.S. and can conduct research on foreign countries' forays into emerging technologies. I think it speaks to another, limitation of the IC so far that we talk about, which is just, I think, the reluctance to take on, open source research research at scale. I think the last one is proprietary sources. Specifically those used by market research, market analytics firms. The finance makes heavy use of those, are becoming really the cutting edge analysis for both state-of-the-art technology and the sectors of the economy that ultimately depend and are driven by them. I think the U.S. needs to make better use, whether it's through a center like that or whether it's through a center that feeds and informs the IC. I think it's immaterial. I think the function does certainly need to exist, and we make that argument in the paper.
Great, thank you so much, John. And Emily, I think you had some thoughts on this point as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really important idea. In addition to understanding where China is on a very granular level in specific technology sectors, I think we also need to make sure we have a really firm understanding of how U.S. firms are operating in the Chinese market, how they're partnering with Chinese firms, how joint ventures, how licensing agreements, how those sorts of commercial arrangements, which I think we still generally want to encourage because it's good for our firms to have access to the world's second largest market. But we need to understand how those sorts of relationships, which we don't often have great visibility into, how those could be leading to erosion of the U.S. technology advantage, how they can be leading to technology transfer, how our firms might be under pressure, under many cases, to transfer technology to local Chinese partners. I think that has to be part of the equation as well when we're thinking about the comparative advantage that the U.S. has vis-a-vis China. It's not like many firms are just in the Chinese market or just in the US market, they're in both. And so how are they straddling that relationship, and how can the government make sure that the technology transfer that is happening is not to our overall detriment?
Yeah, that's an important point. Mike, go ahead, please.
Yeah, if I can build on Emily's point here, I couldn't agree more. I think we need to recognize that there's a big difference in how the Chinese government views these relationships versus our capitalistic, I don't know if the government has a unified view, but for the Chinese, they're all about the technology transfer and how are they going to build their national capabilities. And we've seen so many cases where a company will start a joint venture in China, the IP is transferred. Pretty soon, the Chinese are competing in a way that makes the joint venture uncompetitive, and there's no need for the joint venture anymore. In the US, we need to recognize that our capital markets are rewarding very short-term performance measures. So with that short-term nature, and the senator alluded to this, we're not building the kind of national capabilities we need. So part of what we need to think about is, what are we rewarding? If we're in a long-term competitive race with China, I've called it a superpower marathon, then going after the last penny in earnings per share is not the right measure. We're not going to be on the forefront of some of these emerging technologies, AI, quantum computing, et cetera, if that's our ultimate metric. And we could find ourselves at the short end of the stick in competing with China if we don't think about how that plays into how our companies operate.
Martin, can I add one more point on this?
Yeah, please do.
Bill's original question. So I think this is a great one. This is one of the advantages that the National Security Council has, is that it's got a source or set of sources of credible analytic information that feed its decision-making process. And whether people agree with them or not, they are seen as the source. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence feeds in the intelligence analysis. The State Department offers its diplomatic perspective. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs is there to offer military advice. We don't have an exact equivalent of that on the technology competition side. There are pockets of this scattered around the US government, particularly in the Department of Commerce, but also lots of other places that may or may not make sense, depending on your perspective. To me, it doesn't exactly matter where it is, or even necessarily what it is. So, but if we're going to start using a or if we are going to have a national technology strategy, if we're going to have to start making choices or are making choices around our own competition and investments and our diplomatic relationships to that end, then we need to have credible sources of information that policymakers say, yes, this is the source or the sources. And that could be housed in the basement at the US Department of Agriculture. It's not really important so long as it exists somewhere and it's recognized as the source. The other thing I would say on that, though, is that we can't just exclusively focus on our foreign competitors. We don't have as many good sources of our own competitive nature, or our own competitive strengths as we should, or to the degree that we do, they are kind of cobbled together from a lot of different places. A lot of information rests in the private sector, naturally, and we need to be able to access that in friendly ways as opposed to extractive ways. I think there's a lot of opportunity for growth in that space.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. No, we're really approaching this issue with one hand tied behind our backs, because we don't even have a good understanding of what U.S. capabilities truly are in a lot of these emerging tech fields. George has a question on foreign talent. Obviously, and when you look at human capital in science and technology fields, America is very much dependent on and benefits from foreign talent in the United States. And George is interested in your thoughts on what the impediments in Congress are towards taking meaningful action to reform visa and immigration laws, ultimately to remove obstacles for the retention of science and technology talent. I'd welcome anyone to jump in on that point.
I'll jump in. I think George is making a critically important point. In Silicon Valley, where I am, we know the tremendous benefit that immigrants have played in the growth of companies, starting companies, leading companies. There's statistics about how much of the large companies in Silicon Valley today are sons or daughters of immigrants, and it's a pretty high percentage. I don't remember the exact number, but we're missing out if we're not thinking about the U.S. as the focal point for the world's greatest talent. We want capital to flow here. We want ideas to flow here. And if we were thinking about how we craft a national technology strategy, a key part of that, as we already talked about, is talent. And therefore, that would frame this immigration debate. So we're not viewing immigration separately as a policy that's very difficult to pull together here, but as part of what we need to do for a national competitiveness, and particularly the strategic competition with China. If we viewed it in that framework, which is what Senator Bennet talked about, then this would be easier for folks to see their way to making these changes so that we were attractive for the world's best talent. We have to be.
Would anyone else like to weigh in on the foreign talent piece?
I'll add maybe just one layer to that, which is that we also need to be thinking about this when we're thinking about how we're making it attractive, setting aside the visa and immigration issues, which are very important, but how are we making it attractive to actually work in a research and development capacity for foreign talent in the United States. For example, the more we are tightening the screws on export controls, the more hoops foreign talent is going to have to jump through to even access that sort of technology domestically because of deemed export requirements. I think that applies kind of across the board. And so there does kind of need to be a reset here in terms of making sure that we are striking that right balance of getting that talent in while taking the appropriate measures we need in order to protect sensitive technology from leaking out through foreign talent, but kind of recognizing that that's a small piece of the overall picture here, and to not get too focused on the defensive concerns so that we're losing sight of the bigger picture positive aspects of being the world leading destination for foreign talent.
So I got to follow. Yeah, Emily raises a really good point. I can't speak to sort of the legal hurdles in Congress, but I'll add that I think a major issue, and the Obama administration's 2015 report on quantum information science, I think, makes this point particularly strongly, which is consistent R&D funding for basic and applied research. Inconsistencies in basic and applied research cause issues with academics, whether they're foreign or domestic, in pursuing an area of research which they're particularly dedicated. And we are in a global market now for R&D funding, and they will go to places that have consistent funding where they can do their research. A good example of this is when Anton Zeilinger, who works out of Vienna on quantum information science, was looking to build a quantum satellite for free space quantum teleportation communication issues. Couldn't get funding from the Austrian government, but his former student, Pan Jianwei, out in China, was able to get that funding from the Chinese government. And they entered a joint project that is now being led by the Chinese. And now they are using that and doing all sorts of research and a number of breakthroughs on free space quantum teleportation. And that's a minor example, but I think it's an important one to demonstrate the effects that can come from a lack of consistent funding. We need students, if they're coming to the US, we want their talent to stay here, and we want the U.S. ecosystem, U.S. industry, U.S. academic institutions to benefit from that. But we have to make a compelling case and a consistent case to allow them to do the research for which they are most passionate.
I'll just add a final point on this, Martin. I don't necessarily know that they're what the right solution on this here, but we need a better conversation in this country about our human capital strategy and needs as a country, not just within the context of the federal government. There's a lot of, I would say, hand waving that is often accurate in terms of we need more engineers, we need more STEM talent, but it's not always linked to what the actual challenges are to getting that STEM talent into place, as all of the other panelists have talked about. We need more girls who code. We need more engineers who can use artificial intelligence. These may be real needs that we're meeting with fellowship programs, educational pursuits, networking opportunities, but they seem to be more based on people's instinct rather than true gap analysis of what is actually necessary and real examination of what the barriers are. On top of which, I think we need to do a better job talking about what the true S&T and innovative needs that we have are. What are the ideas that we're looking to have more talent around, as opposed to saying that we need more people who can develop apps to deliver pizza, which, don't get me wrong, I love. What are the actual things that people can put their imaginations behind that really capture their talent and their interest and their interest in public service, and telling those stories a bit better so that we're bringing the existing talent that we have into spaces that are going to make the most difference.
Yeah, that's a key point, right? Because ultimately, all these decisions, we really can't make them unless we have that strategic framework to do it, because we can't have it all. We're going to have to set priorities, and there will be trade-offs. And until we actually say, this is where we want to be 20, 30 years down the road, we cannot make the decisions that we need in order to prioritize how to get to that point. And I think across the board, that's what we're facing with all these issues. What type of human capital do we need? What technology directions do we want to pursue most aggressively? Where do we want to be the world leaders? And perhaps there are areas where it's okay if we're in the middle of the pack in terms of competitiveness. Well, I shouldn't say middle of the pack, like near the top, of course, but not necessarily at the cutting edge across the board. So, Lauren, a lot of this ultimately comes down to how we implement a strategy as well, right? And so you were the lead author of the report, Trust the Process, which was all about the bureaucratic and organizational changes that need to be made to, and specifically on strategy implementations, you had some detailed recommendations. Could you walk us through what some of those are and how you view the prospects for very necessary changes to actually take place?
Absolutely. So everyone's instinct when they look at these issues is to say, we need to reorganize the National Security Council, or apologies to the center, that we need a new council in order to take these on. It's not that I disagree with those recommendations. It's that we need so much more than that in order to make sure that those that council's title and authority are actually implemented in some way. Some of the key ingredients that I talk about in the report that I offer is that you need, as I was saying earlier, you need to create infrastructure for credible analysis. I won't repeat myself on that, but you need to be able to have information and that people agree is the information. This is the analysis that we need in order to support decision-making processes. You need to be able to align the resources, get an understanding of what you're already spending in the federal government, where you're putting talent, where you're spending dollars inside government and outside, and be able to map that as against what your priorities are. Does OMB already track where our R&D dollars are? Somewhat, but not as comprehensively as we might want. And better organize around and get a better organization around like where we're exactly spending right now. I think we need to build more capacity in within the federal government. We've already talked about the talent issues. I think there's probably more that we could do within agencies to build up, whether it be certification programs or professional development, so that we have key leads within agencies who can speak to technology competition. Just as an example of this, we were talking about allies earlier. So within the State Department right now, there's absolutely people who can represent the United States in talking about these issues. Don't get me wrong on that. But we need many, many more of them. There's so much of what they do today that is not that does not recognize some of the key challenges that we have in technology competition. And building a diplomatic corps that can lead on these issues is important. And I think the last thing I'll mention is that we need to figure out great ways to engage stakeholders in the US context, whether this be academia, as we were talking about before, industry, and others who do research and development in the federal space, in order to create common vocabulary, to talk about common risks, to understand what we see as our common needs, where we see US advantages and where we're falling behind. So much, even in this conversation, we use similar terminology, but we actually mean quite different things. This happens over and over again when we're talking about emerging technologies across the government, across the private sector, across nonprofit and elsewhere. Just creating multi-stakeholder groups, creating councils that are looking at innovation, creating opportunities just to share ideas and understand threats. There's lots of ways to do this that I talk about in the report, but the bottom line is to start and not to assume that everybody's on the same page just when they say that we need more American innovation. Everyone has different ideas about what that means. So I'll stop there, and coming back to my first point, don't just assume you can create a council and solve all the problems that we need to have. There's much more that needs to go into it besides that.
Thank you, Lauren. Emily, I want to return to a point you touched on earlier, and that's the protect pillar of a national technology strategy, right? So how do you safeguard your technological advantages? And so over the past few years, the U.S. government has taken a new approach to economic statecraft. And could you tell us, talk a little bit about how you see that shift and whether or not it's sustainable for the long term, or if we need to think about making adjustments to acts like export controls and sanctions and tariffs? How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, it's a great question. And clearly the US government, and this is, I think, a bipartisan, executive branch, legislative branch, broad agreement that there has been this need to use a much wider range of coercive economic statecraft, defensive tools, whatever you want to call it. You just listed them out there, Martin. Because of the kind of unique nature of the threat presented by China. We haven't really had this sort of challenge before where we have a strategic competitor, I guess is what we're calling it these days, who's so deeply integrated into our economy. And so that raises unique challenges when it comes to an open market system. have had an open market, open economy, free trading system for a very long time for very good reasons, because we think that is the best way to achieve growth. But when you have a country who wants to exploit that, then all of a sudden you do need to start putting in these additional tools to make sure that there are the necessary protections in place. And so that is why over the course of the last 5 to 6 years, and this started in the Obama administration, although clearly took off under the Trump administration and is continuing today, you see a much more heavy use of export controls to stop particular technology flows. You see a really robust use of investment screening and the CFIUS process, to the extent where, there's some certain sectors that Chinese companies just basically can't buy any US companies. Semiconductors is a good example of that. You see kind of novel uses of some old standing tools like IEPA to try to get at some of these issues as well. And across the board, I don't think that trend is going away. It's not like the challenges associated with the Chinese economic integration all of a sudden doesn't have any risk associated with it, right? That is going to be kind of a permanent feature of the relationship for quite some time. There's going to be, I think, efforts to target, to make some of these things smarter. On some of these efforts, there's a lot of implementation work that needs to happen, frankly, whether it's under the existing export control reform work or some of the ICTS trade restrictions. There's some good ideas in place, but it really needs to be implemented and staffed so it can actually have faithful execution to what the design of that policy was. And so I do think that's an area that's going to continue. I think what we're also seeing, though, is a desire to try to, and this is what the conversation today is how do you marry that with the positive agenda for what the US needs to do to grow its own economy, right? It's not just tripping the other guy, it's running faster, and how do we run faster? And so it does need to be both.
Great, thank you, Emily. So John, part of that running faster element and the protect element rests with the Department of Commerce. And in the report from Plan to Action, you put forward some very detailed recommendations as far as expanding the authorities of the Department of Commerce in order to actually play the role that is expected of it. Now, can you walk us through what some of those recommendations are and some hurdles that you foresee in actually making that happen?
Certainly, Martin. I think that if we look at the department or across the litany of the Department of agencies, we see, a very robust landscape of authorities that can be used to achieve a strategic effect in the technology space. But if we're looking at the intersection of technology and the economy, whether it's playing defense, as Emily eloquently put, or pushing forward on a more proactive vision, the Department of Commerce really has the set of tools, it has the critical mass of tools by which that can be accomplished. So, I think we have to take a look at how do we invest, in looking at executing that strategy, how do we invest and empower that department or agency that has the critical mass of tools? How do we increase their resources, and how do we get them to a place where they can do so effectively, where their capabilities meet the challenge of the responsibility that we've set upon their shoulders. So we do so in a few different ways. One, a lot of the recommendations focus on the Bureau of Industry and Security, which has responsibility for implementing export controls. And export controls are one of the foremost tools we use to both, I think, defend some of our economic interests and national security interests, as well as, again, as Emily put, to trip the other guy, so to speak. I think investing in the Bureau of Industry Security through a number of ways. One is to open up, I think, the defense budget a little bit to try to help get them additional resources that can be utilized. The defense budget is used outside the DoD in a number of circumstances. One is to help fund the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. The other is certain portions of the FBI in a few other ways. I think you make that argument by saying that the Department of Defense, the military, is inextricably linked with the work that the Department of Commerce would be undertaking from an export control perspective. I think number two, from a human capital standpoint, we've got to give them more flexible and more expeditious hiring authorities. Coming from a strong cyber background, we have similar issues with recruiting and retaining highly qualified talent in the cyber domain. We've met that challenge a little bit by additional pay incentives through cyber pay and through accepted service hiring authorities. It skips the competitive process and gets you a potential hire far more directly. Doesn't speed up the clearance process, which will continue to remain a hurdle, regardless of where you get hired in the U.S. government. But it does help out in getting the talent that you identify is most qualified in quickly. I think another one, and this one, there's a lot of debate, I think, with the authors about where this should go and from some of the commentators, but also designating the Department of Commerce as a member of the intelligence community. I think that would certainly maybe controversial, but I find it to be a compelling recommendation. The Department of Commerce, as we look towards some of the challenges in the technology space, we have to look at what potentially could the Commerce Department both provide to the intelligence community and what they could benefit from being closer and more integrated with the intelligence community. And just to sort of further clarify, it doesn't mean the entire Department of Commerce is going to be a part of the intelligence community. That designation usually rests with an office or a sub-office in some portion of the department that maintains those authorities and acts as a member of the intelligence community. I think we have to ask ourselves, with additional resources that could come from that designation and integration, as well as the increased availability of clearances and information, could we yield a better policy on the technology and economic front by doing so? Could commerce benefit from that in their some of the actions they want to take in both from a defense and offense standpoint? I think the answer to both of those is yes. I think the challenges that would come from that, I think, are manageable. So those are just a few of the things that we mentioned. One I'd like to add additionally is IEPA. Emily raised this. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act is a workhorse of some of the programs that we're utilizing to play defense on now. One EO 13083, which was I think passed a few years ago, signed by the president, is meant to defend our ICT infrastructure from high-risk vendors that may be under the undue influence of a foreign power. That rests on IEPA authority, which is an emergency authority. But I think we have to ask ourselves from a good governance perspective, if we are utilizing an emergency declaration as an enduring program and an enduring policy matter, should it be codified into law? With all the exceptions and all the additional caveats for clarity and certainty that would be necessary to rest it on a firm legal foundation. I would say as an additional fact, as an EO, it is an unfunded mandate. As law, it would be something that would be justified for additional resources from the appropriations, put it on even better resource and financial.
Hey, John, let me jump in here real quick because we only have a few minutes left, and I'd like to give Mike a chance to say a few remarks as well. So, Mike, apologies, I had missed your cue that you wanted to add some thoughts to what Lauren was saying earlier, but I'd also like to pose you a question that we got in from Twitter, which it's essentially a follow-up question to the remarks you made earlier about cooperating with allies and partners. And the question here is, private firms with valuable technologies in allied countries, they have their own interests and compete with each other. And so the Twitter user would like to know, how do you think the U.S. can coordinate these conflicting interests, which of course is a very fundamental question as we start looking at complementary strategies on a range of tech policies. So go ahead, please, Mike.
Yeah, I think this actually is a feature because competition is good. This is what has allowed us to have such a prosperous economy. I think the one thing that gives me comfort in how China is behaving is you choose a national champion. Imagine if we had chose as companies that were leading in technology in the 1960s, our national champions today, we probably wouldn't be happy with the outcome. So I don't think that's a strategy for success. What we need to do is make sure that the foundation is laid for technology and ensure that there's competition in these sectors that we choose that is very robust. So in other words, if it's AI, we need to make sure that we're doing the right research, getting the right talent, the foundation is there to commercialize the technology as it comes out of national labs, et cetera. But then let the competition flow, and that includes with key allies as well. I just want to add a couple of points to the technology strategy conversation that we're having that I think are very important in addition to the policy recommendations that we talked about. One is the investment. We're not investing enough in the country in basic research. We've let the federally funded R&D decline. The second is, I talked about a little bit earlier, the long-term nature that we need companies thinking in rather than quarters and pennies per share. How do we change that? That's a key part of how we develop the national capabilities we're going to need to support a technology strategy. So that's a separate piece of work in and of itself. And then maybe tying Lauren's comments about the talent with Senator Bennett's. We need to inspire young people. This is a cultural change we need to make to not just celebrate Wall Street and sports heroes. We need to change the culture so that we're celebrating the technology and science achievements in the country. And I think there's a lot of room to go there. Moonshots that we need to create. When was the last time we had a national moonshot? Certainly sequencing the human genome, that was quite a ways ago. But we could be creating these moonshots with OSTP in all of these critical and emerging technologies. And to Senator Bennett's point, if we inspire the young people in the country to get after this, I think we'll be really pleased with the results. That's another key element. Love to see us do. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike. We have time for one lightning round question. I'd love to get everyone's thoughts on this. So Lauren, we'll start with you, then Emily, John, and we'll give Mike the last word. So this is a question that came in from AP. And this is a great question. I like this one a lot. So are there any areas you recommend for technical or scientific cooperation with China? Which global challenges do we need to work together on, or at least work towards similar goals? So Lauren, take it
Easy
away.
one, climate change. And I hope everyone will probably agree and then give a better example and offer more specificity there. It's one where I think there's a lot of groundwork already laid, and I think we can do a lot more in order to work collaboratively with one another towards this true crisis that we don't treat as a crisis in our country.
Great. Emily?
So I agree with the caveat that it's going to be darn hard to do it, just given the tensions between the two countries. But also when you look at greening supply chains and that sort of thing, that's actually where we've had some of the biggest concerns with China when you're talking about solar panels, when you're talking about human rights abuses and Xinjiang on polysilicon. So yes, absolutely. I don't see how you solve the climate problem without working with China. But there's some real thorny issues in there that we're going to have to sort through on the way.
Great. Thanks so much. Go ahead, John.
The benefit of a good answer and the right answer is it's very little for me to add or detract. I'd have to agree with Lauren on that.
Perfect. Mike, last word for you.
Definitely climate change, but I would add nuclear non-proliferation monitoring technology. Certainly like their help with North Korea on that point, and pandemics. This isn't going to be the last pandemic we're going to see. I'm not very pleased with how they responded to the first one, but it's an opportunity where we really need global cooperation. We didn't do a great job as a globe on this past one. We need to be more prepared for the next one.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Well, on that note, I want to thank you all very much for joining us today. Big thank you to Senator Bennet, Mike Brown, Lauren Schulman, Emily Kilcrease, John Costello. And of course, I also want to thank our comms team who does a lot of work behind the scenes that make these events so great and so smooth. So Jasmine Butler, Anna Peterson, and Shai Corman, thank you all so much. Thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate the great audience questions, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon. Take care, everyone.